Hi, everyone. Next in our Jacob Land discussions is another part of science. And again, those of you that can't read my hieroglyphics, that's creation versus evolution. So today we're going to take a quick look at the mid 1800s in terms of this. And then, of course, you know where we're headed, and that is towards the evolutionary ideas of Charles Darwin versus the revival of the church and also the questioning of the church. So, again, with no further ado, let's go. So, brief history here as we look at things and a quick refresher before we even get to this slide. We have to remember that Newton sets us off with the scientific revolution of the 1600s, early 1700s, and his idea that nature operates under simple and orderly laws or mechanical principles is still the idea. And so everyone, again, politically, socially, is trying to explain themselves through this idea of natural law and subsequently natural rights. We see the world as rational, we see it as mechanical, and we see it as dependable. In the past, I used the example of a watch or a clock, and the idea that the watch is battery free, and once it's set into motion, it forever continues to operate under the simple and orderly movements and laws of nature. Scientist, this word to describe these people that look at this branch of society, also becomes a prevalent term. So now these people in the 1800s are looking back to the 1600s and coining the phrase scientific revolution. All right, let's look at the key people here and move through this era. First, we have Auguste Comte, and Comte is known as the father of sociology. And more significantly, the ism that he's associated with is this idea of positivism. And this idea of positivism relies on the philosophy that human intellectual development can be culminated through the works of science. And so he comes up with three distinct ideas in human intellectual development. He says at first there was a theological stage, so a religious stage. Second, we've talked about a metaphysical stage, so a spiritual and physical combination. And then finally, we're looking at a new stage of description known as the positive stage. And the positive stage, just for simplicity, would be the exact observations and descriptions of phenomena. So I might look at an object and describe it physically and accurately in terms of what it is, its motion, so on and so forth. Again, as I mentioned, Comte was the father of sociology. And so, again, briefly, psychology is the study of the individual and ideas. And we'll hit psychology here down the road. And Comte, with the idea of sociology, is the study of groups and how groups function. All right, let's go move on to where we are. And so, science and culture in this new age of realism. The growth of scientific research and the interest in it is tremendous. So, this is an age where physics, biology, chemistry continue to grow significantly. We're going to see answers to problems, and we're going to understand much more in depth the scientific fields. Not to say that we aren't currently continuing to expand our knowledge tremendously, but this era would certainly compare to what we are doing today. Faith in science also begins to erode religious faith, and so we'll touch on this as well. And again, the more something becomes concrete, the more difficult it is to demonstrate an abstract or spiritual side of things, as we shall see. So, the key figure here is Charles Darwin and his theory of organic evolution. So, Darwin will study exclusively and remotely plant and animal species. And through this, he will come up with his idea of adaptation or evolution. So more specifically, as we look at this, Darwin talks about how over time species would evolve through natural selection. And so natural selection is a mechanistic feature. It requires no guidance or spiritual mental idea beyond a simple development of an organic nature. So, animals in the wild today, why does one survive and one perish? These people would look at it and say, again, through a mechanistic view of the world, the animal that perishes was not fit enough to survive those given circumstances, not because of luck or some other spiritual guidance. Darwinism obviously is going to contradict the Bible, and so this is going to therefore also contradict the ideas of creation and question and in a way attempt to undermine the existence of God and the fixation within nature. So obviously you're on a touchy area there, and that's going to impact science and impact society and also impact religion significantly. So again, where does he get this from? Well, one of his big influences is Thomas Malthus, if we remember him from our first round of industrialization and economic theory. Malthus had said that more living organisms tend to come into existence than can survive in a given environment. And so, therefore, because of this, there has to be some selection process or way to limit the amount in a society. Let's move on here and continue. His second writing, The Descent of Man. Now he begins to apply the ideas of evolution to mankind. And so Darwin says that humans or humanity's moral nature and religious sentiments, as well as our physicality, were all developed in responses to the need to survive and the need to physically evolve in order to progress. One could look at themselves and say, are we evolving today? And we could also look at science today and say, are we challenging evolution? And so, are we evolving today? Maybe questioned in a way that are we physically stronger and faster in order to survive our society? Is it our brains that are evolving, or somehow physically we are changing in order to match our environmental needs? From the second part of this, again, we take a look at this in a moral and religious idea. We say that morally and religiously, are we utilizing our physical environment in order to morally progress and move on. And so, again, religion and morality will be big question marks here. As we move along and we look at this need for survival, we're going to look at the ethical component of this as well. And so philosophers will look at the struggle for survival, and they'll look at humanity and look at our social relationships. We had talked about that in a previous short discussion with the ideas of positivism and Kant. So if we have this idea of a survival of the fittest, then may we or could we apply this to not only man, but also society? And so evolutionary ethics, and really the big idea here is social Darwinism, will be the next thing that progresses. And so as we move along here, survival of the fittest again is our theme. And our first person is Herbert Spencer. Spencer is a British philosopher, and he will take a look at these evolutionary ideas, and he's going to validate this idea that humanity progresses through competing or through competition. And so if we compete, somebody must be a winner, and somebody therefore must lose. And so this would justify the idea of not helping or aiding the lower classes, especially the poor and the proletariat or working class. It also will validate, as we shall see, the ideas of colonial expansion, so imperialism or empire building, where we validate this ideology that it is our right and our need to take over lesser peoples and to civilize them, which becomes part of a civilizing mission, as Rudyard Kipling talked about. Again, we'll see that here in the near future. Not only does it justify all of those things, but it's also going to justify a competition among nations. And so might makes right becomes a proverbial theme in this era for sure, again. And so if we look at that in today's example, we've talked about this in class before. We have a wonderful society in America. The reason why we're able to have that wonderful society is because of our military strength. If our military was not the best and the strongest in the world, we may or may not have some of the ideas and freedoms that we currently have in our society. Our second person is Thomas Huxley, and he is an opponent of evolutionary ethics and ideas, and his statement is pretty straightforward. He says that the physical process of evolution is at an odd with ethical development. So the struggles in nature, so the things that Darwin and Spencer have pointed out, are things that aren't necessarily good. The struggle in nature isn't necessarily the way humanity should behave. And so as we look at that, we talk about this idea that no, we shouldn't ignore the lower classes. We should reach out and help those people, and we should all progress together instead of an evolution of the fittest. Intellectual skepticism follows suit here with all of this, and so these intellectuals and their skeptical ideas will challenge historical credibilities and the accuracy of science, and as well as the morality of the church itself. And so, again, we've seen this before historically, back in the days of the Renaissance, the value of mankind as we sought to give ourselves distinction. We went to the scientific revolution, where we had an intense age of skepticism and incredible doubt, where we believed literally next to nothing and proved everything, including our own existence. So now we're looking at this again from an intellectual standpoint and challenging again the credibility of history, the credibility of scientific accuracies, as well as the church and its moralities. A couple people here of significance. First is David Strauss, and Strauss will question whether there is a true biblical historical basis for Jesus. And so he will bring about this idea that Jesus may be a myth and not indeed a true figure. There have been others that have questioned the Bible as well, saying, is this a series of stories that we should look at and utilize the morality from the stories as opposed to a reality? Obviously, on the other side of the spectrum, there's been much scientific evidence that has said the biblical experiences and things have truly existed. So I'm not here to judge. I'm just simply historically giving you the sides of this respective story. Our second person here of note is Charles Lyell. And so Charles Lyell, in his studies of geology, will come along and he will state that the earth is much, much older than what the biblical records say or claim the earth to be. And so as he looks at the natural phenomena behind the creations of mountains, of canyons, of floods, etc., he attempts to remove the workings of God from the physical development of earth. And so anthropologists, sociologists, and even psychologists begin to arrive at ideas that question the religious sentiments of history and whether those are just simply offshoots of natural ideas that have occurred. Our last person here is Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Nietzsche will be very, very substantial to the 20th century ideologies. So looking back here, as we study this idea in moralities, we look at the God of the Old Testament, as we talked about with the development of ethical monotheism and the development of a God that was intolerable and unpredictable at times, that moved towards a tolerant and rational God as mankind developed. We see a New Testament God that is willing to sacrifice and give and demonstrate an incredible level of kindness and compassion. Nietzsche comes along, and Nietzsche says that Christianity, on the whole, is something that glorifies the weaknesses rather than the strengths that are needed for life. And again, we'll look a little more into him as we approach the 19th century philosophies. He says that war as well as courage have accomplished far more than simply loving thy neighbor. And so again, not saying that this is right or wrong, but in terms of his philosophy, again, following this ideology of might makes right. We can see this in this time frame through the developments of people like Bismarck, for example, and the ideas of realpolitik. Finally, As we look at an age of realism, we see various scientists come along and again, very positive contributions. So, pasteurization of milk, you may be familiar with that. We look at the causation of disease, bacterias, viruses, as we're dealing with our situation in the early part of 2020 here as well. New surgical practices, so the idea of using anesthesia and antiseptics. Imagine that in the good old days where they would take the surgical instruments and wash them off with some well water and then use them on the next person. So you can only imagine how quickly and rampantly the spread of bacteria was. Anesthesia as well. There was a time when anesthesia was not used. It was simply tie the person down so they can't move and cut away. And so you can only imagine how painful and troubling that could be. Public health measures as well. Sanitation is a big one. Again, the development of cities, we recall, was originally following waterways. Now we're developing them increasingly in grid-like structures. Part of that is so that we could develop an efficient sanitation system. So instead of using the commode or emptying the bath water into the streets and letting all that flow down the streets and the children and everyone else plays in it, and then remember where all that water and sewage ends up in the rivers that you get your water from. So we can only imagine how environmentally disgusting all of this was. We see new public health measures coming along to, at first, help with these kind of situations. By the turn of the century, the production of food will be challenged and questioned and improved. And then also factories and emissions and things of that nature. So pollution and environment are becoming increasingly on the minds of the people. New medical schools, advanced training and professionalization. Women in medical schools, although there are obstacles to education and professional recognition, we do see the allowance or the ability of women to increasingly become involved in the educational realm. In the Gross Clinic here, you can see this picture. Scalpel in hand, pausing midway on a young man's leg to discuss the operation, so we can see how these types of development will further. Finally, we will see how realism touches in literature as well. And so science and culture, we reject romanticism. We look at the ordinary and observations. So Flaubert and Madame Bovary, as the book describes. Charles Dickens is very, very significant. We had once thought that Dickens was simply a fictional writer, but we see how he describes very accurately the lives of the 1800s people in Britain's lower and middle classes. In art, again, we see several people of note, and in music as well, the twilight of romanticism is hitting in this mid to latter part of the 1800s. We see a lot of nationalist themes. Franz Liszt, Wagner, and others will push and promote this. Okay, Courbet, again, realism. As you look at this picture, you see the difficulty and trouble that it would take to break this rock up. So no positive emotion, enjoyable feeling here. This is reality of daily activities of the people. Again, another picture here as well, showing the daily activities of the French peasants. Again, sun up to sundown, working the fields. None of this looks like a lot of fun. To wrap it up, here's a timeline of the chapter. We discussed, again, Louis Napoleon at first becoming emperor and how he was domestically very good, at least early on, because he had a lot of control. Foreign policy-wise, we know he had many, many struggles. We looked at the revolutions of 1848 and then subsequently the unification of Italy, the unification of Germany, the removal of Austria from the German Confederation, and then within a year, the creation of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. We looked at the development of British reform policies, and we looked at finally from a scientific standpoint and scientific applications to mankind, the Communist Manifesto and socialism and communism, and then the theories of evolution and advances in science and realism in art and music. Take care, everybody. We'll be back shortly with chapters 23 and 24.